Hi everybody and welcome to another G News update on Thursday the 15th of May. Well, it's good to see you all again, and yes, a lot of things have happened in the last 24 hours. Both of our TV stations ran with lead stories surrounding the C-bomb being used by Brooke Van Velden in Parliament yesterday. But I'd like to note that this was a distraction from the core issues that we're really concerned about, which centre around the outrage and the travesty of what National have done around pay equity, being led around by the nose by the ACT Party here. However, having said that, I think it's actually worth pointing out that this distraction also came at a time when media were seeing another story emerge, which was the story around over punishment of Te Pāti Māori for doing the Haka after the system that we have led by the Privileges Committee and Jerry Brownlee refused to allow tikanga into the considerations of the Privileges Committee, which I think set us all back given that we're operating under te tiriti in this country. So those are my first remarks. But let's also step back for a second and consider that Andrea Vance is always at the heart of things when it comes to some kind of distraction or advantage for the National Party. And we saw this before the election. About 4 months out, Andrea Vance revealed a story where an anonymous person said that years ago Kerry Allen had raised her voice in some kind of session, and it was all anonymous and we didn't know. But all the heads in media turned, and the lead story for the next 5 or 6 days was Kerry Allen and whether she'd raised her voice or not years ago. So this was Andrea Vance, and right now Andrea Vance has, in a strange way, come to the rescue of the National Party again, who were really in the gun and desperate for some kind of distraction, in a corner, lashing out, calling everybody else a liar, trying to reach for distractions away from what they'd really done. So I think there is that. On the other hand, there's the free speech argument. So Sean Plunkett should be outraged this morning that the National Party want to close down free speech. Having said that, and putting all nutters aside, there are standards of decorum in Parliament, and using the C word's not appropriate in certain places, and so there is that. And I think what I want to get to first of all today is the way in which media chose to make the C-bomb and the kind of attempt by the National Party and the ACT Party to grab the higher ground and steal the narrative back off the Labour Party, happening thing for their news audiences last night at TVNZ1 News and at News on 3. We just see those choices by media then kind of being blamed on the Labour Party. And Lloyd Burr last night actually said that Jan Tinetti was unrepentant for asking questions.
Jan Tinetti unrepentant about her role in it.
There are certain words there that I cannot stand.
So should she have used that word in the Parliament?
Well, I wouldn't. And
But
it was used today, and I didn't like it. I didn't like hearing it. I struggled with hearing it.
But you sort of brought that on, though.
I don't believe I did. That was a choice that was made.
And I think that kind of technique that journalists use to make headlines out of a defence, maybe an innocent defence, it kind of comes with a smear that you must be guilty and therefore you're defending yourself and you're on the back foot and you're explaining. And I think Lloyd Burr needed to be a bit careful when he did mention that Jan was unrepentant. However, Jan said that she wouldn't have used that word herself, and I think she's just speaking from the heart there, that authentically and sincerely, that it's not something she would do. But it's something that Nicola Willis was approved of, using the C word in Parliament was past her standards, and it's the standards that the ACT Party accept for language in Parliament. Predictably, Winston Peters, whose main enemy in life is the ACT Party, held his head in his hands and tried to get some votes out of the whole situation, putting on a big sort of dance and routine for everybody when he himself is wasting parliamentary time all the time. Anyway, let's just focus on the question that the media didn't focus on, which was this one from Jan Tinetti when she asked Brooke Van Velden about the consultation behind this decision. You know, who had ACT Party people talked to, who had National spoken to, what research had they done? And here's what Van Velden had to say to that question.
Was changing the threshold for female-dominated work from 60 to 70% a result of feedback and consultation, or simply the first number the minister thought of?
I can think of many numbers, and I would suspect that the Minister for Women should stop refraining from attention. The former Minister for Women should refrain from any attempt to conflate those numbers with girl math like Andrea Vance did.
So as you can see, Van Velden was incoherent and a gibbering monkey by this stage because she was overcome with herself and her grand, strong woman stand, you know, standing up to the characterization in Andrea Vance's article, which, if you look at the context, actually only said that if you're prepared to act like a C word, and you could have put psychopath in there, or a cruel person, someone that didn't care about low-income women, someone who was heartless. And, you know, I think that the C word probably was one of those things where Andrea Vance, you know, was chewing on nails and is a very passionate person. But as per usual, it works in the favour of the National Party. So moving on from there, I think one of the problems that we see about the pay equity debate is that nobody seems to be able to explain the difference between roles and skills and job factors, and we get lost in the language when a picture is needed. So I've taken the opportunity this morning to outline a visual explainer of what I mean when I'm talking about a 14-factor matrix that has been used, and the way in which Chris Bishop and Nicola Willis and Christopher Luxon continue to conflate the matrix with just the roles that are actually described and say, well, you just can't compare these roles, and we've got a system that compares roles and you can't do that. So that justifies us shrinking the scope so that it's only inside a single industry. So all the health workers have to compare themselves to every other health worker if they want pay equity, instead of across industries, for example. Here's a little video explainer that I made this morning to try and explain the error that is passing by all of our media, who don't seem interested in showing this, in the same way that it wasn't lead news story that Brooke Van Velden couldn't answer the question about consultation or research at all in Parliament yesterday. That skipped past media. Here's my explainer, and hopefully at the end of this it'll be all much clearer with the visual aid. So what would a skills matrix look like? Well, instead of just having roles across like the top of the page, like here where you might have roles, let's say a social worker is a role, and a mechanic is a role, a librarian, and let's say an air traffic controller. If we have, for example, these four roles arrayed across the top of the page, then when we make comparisons between them, they seem as if they're like crazy. Like, we've got a terrible system here, taking like predominantly female industries, comparing them to male industries, and it just doesn't work at that level because that's the level of roles. But if you add skills to the columns below each of the roles, then you can start putting in a bunch of numbers. So skills like the ability to plan, the ability to organize, the ability to solve problems, problem solving. And maybe there are physical demands in the job, physical demands. Perhaps there's also stress and emotion involved in the job. So you get a situation like this down here where you're starting to list some of the factors. Like maybe you have a responsibility to the public. And so you get the general idea that if we were to put a line under each of these skills and each of these physical demands or stress or job factors, what we're starting to see here is skills and job factors down here, and along the top you've got your roles. Now this is the part where the government says, well, look, it's all just too complicated. But basically panels of people and experts then assign various numbers to just how much of these skills are in each of these roles. Like a social worker may have to do quite a bit of planning, especially if it's, say, for oranga tamariki and you're chasing people around who are very hard to contact. And a mechanic may actually have to do quite a bit of planning in order to fit in all of the people that are queuing up to get their car fixed. A librarian may have a lesser degree of planning. Perhaps they actually have to organise information from all over the world. So there's quite a bit of organising going on there. So I'd say a librarian has quite a lot of organising. And, you know, you start to give a rating or a number like this to various parts of the role. So you might fill this in, and don't worry about whatever I'm saying here. You know, there could be a different level of planning, but a social worker might have to do quite a bit of planning, a mechanic a bit less, a librarian, yeah, let's just say like a medium level, and an air traffic controller. Well, they need to know what's happening every day, so let's give that a 10. Maybe over in organising yourself, there's a high degree of organisation required to be a social worker, but less really to be a mechanic, and probably about a similar amount for an air traffic controller. When it comes to solving problems, this is a 10 for a social worker. It's also quite high for a mechanic. A librarian, less so, so let's say it's a 6. And an air traffic controller may not have to solve too many problems, but when they do, they're very, very important. So this aspect could also be a 10. The physical demands on a social worker may be just medium. For the mechanic, it's quite a bit more. For a librarian, it's less. For an air traffic controller, it's not so bad. But when it comes to stress, there's a 10 there. For a librarian, it's less, possibly a 4. For a mechanic, it's most likely to be less, something like a 7. For a social worker, it'll be really high, maybe a 9 or a 10. Yes, a social worker is responsible to the public, so that's a good 9. For a mechanic, yes, that's also a good 9. For a librarian, that's also an 8. And for an air traffic controller, it's definitely a 10. Now, this is what we've got. We've got a matrix of numbers here, and we can see that when it comes to pay, this is actually quite useful. If these were all agreed, these numbers, and this is what the negotiations are about, this is a very comprehensive matrix. It's a system in which you can then say, well, for this role, you add all those aspects up and you get a number down here. What's the total number? And you add them all up and you compare all the different complexities in the roles. So this is basically an outline of how pay equity was actually being evaluated under the system that Nicola Willis and Erica Stanford and the rest of the National Party agreed to fully up until about a year ago, but recently have just flip-flopped 100% because David Seymour says that Brooke Van Velden has saved billions for Nicola Willis's budget. So all of this comprehensiveness has now been characterized as too complicated. It's too unworkable. It's not possible for people to get together and accord these numbers to these roles. In fact, they just want to say, look, it's ridiculous that at this level, at the role level, that any kind of comparison could ever possibly be made between the much higher value male roles and the low value, who cares about those roles, women's roles. That's just bizarre. And that's what you hear on a lot of media and from National. They never get down this column. They never talk about skills. And I think that's the outrage, or one of the outrages. So this is my simple explanation, more visually this morning, for anyone that was wondering what we're talking about. If you had a matrix behind the evaluation, it's not that hard. It's just like a spreadsheet. So that's all I'm saying here. So the other big story at the moment is the disproportionate punishment of the Te Pāti Māori at the mercy of Judith Collins and some other fairly white privileged people on the Privileges Committee, and how they've just not actually involved themselves in tikanga at all, just sent tikanga to the ditch, given a kick to the curb, said it's just got no part in a treaty-centric New Zealand, while they're beating their chests every Waitangi Day and showing up and saying that it matters. Like, clearly doesn't matter to them, does it? And I think we need to actually protest this. I believe there will be protests coming about this, but I stand with Te Pāti Māori here. They've been badly treated by our system, which needs to be updated and catch up. We need to do a review. We need to ensure that we're more inclusive, and the Haka has its place. It's just ridiculous that this has actually resulted in a historically overreached punishment in order to send a message to every single person of Maori descent that there is no part for them in New Zealand politics, that their customs and ways are to be superseded by the English system of law, and that is the only law, and that's what's meant by our treaty. That, you know, we just get to completely overrule all of the ways and I don't know, tino rangatiratanga of the chiefs and their families and their descendants. It's just pathetic. Anyway, having said that, a third big story in the news was the Greens and the way that the Greens came out with an alternative budget. That budget would give us free health care from our GPs, it would give us free dental care and free early childhood education. But this would be on the back of things like luxury jets. And we heard in the news yesterday that the number of luxury jets that are flying into New Zealand had doubled in recent years. But we also heard a lot of complaining and moaning and griping without any real evidence or numbers behind it, that this would somehow affect the luxury tourism industry. And there was also kind of like a similar argument without evidence, like we hear around capital flight, that everyone would leave New Zealand if we touched the tax system for the wealthy at all. No one would come to New Zealand in their private jet because $5,000 would actually scare away people that spend more than that every day on lunch. And so none of it actually stacked up, but as per usual, the arguments made in the media kind of end where it suits the wealthy, and we don't go any further than that and explore it because we basically don't have time in our media. Everything's so concise and time-driven, it's time for another commercial. A fourth story basically is the fact that we haven't actually talked about the Waitangi Tribunal that much in the news. There's been some news about this, but here's a clip from Te Ao News, Māori News, that covers some legal opinion on what we saw at the Waitangi Tribunal yesterday in relationship to David Seymour's regulatory standards bill that seeks to raise property rights and drive libertarian values over the top of Te Treaty.
Undisputed fact that the Crown has entirely failed to engage with Māori at all in the development of this bill.
Parliament has chosen to limit the constraint on the tribunal's jurisdiction only to specific interference with its own processes, apart from that the tribunal is empowered to examine all poor conduct.
As the claimants have observed, the Crown is continuing to withhold critical information in the redacted treaty impact analysis that likely reveals the true nature of the significant impacts of the RSB on Te Tiriti and on the treaty principles.
There is more than enough evidence to date that the intention is to override or exclude consideration of Te Tiriti in the regulation process. Both the process and substance of the bill that seeks to do so are fundamentally flawed. From a Te Tiriti perspective, it should not be allowed to proceed.
Christopher Luxon has already agreed 100% in coalition arrangements to just drive the treaty from our shores when it comes to regulation, and that courts and everybody else can just bugger off because we're going to actually just corporate take over everything in this country using the Regulatory Standards Bill as our guide, and we'll just call anything that suits us and makes a profit for the wealthy a good law and a good regulation. So I think that's probably enough for one day, but we still haven't had a good discussion about debt and how our net worth has grown so much over the last 10 years. We don't talk about that when we're having a debate about debt. Newspapers always focus on debt. When it came to the Green Party, debt, cost, but not the benefits. Really, that's how News Talk ZB and how the New Zealand Herald led in all of their headlines, that it was really all about costs and who cares about the benefits, scoffing, abusing, and putting down the Green Party, playing the person ad hominem attacks from Winston Peters, ridiculous arguments that don't stand up but are swallowed by cookers and people that don't really discriminate or think too much about their country or what's happening in politics. So I think that kind of level of politics is gutter, and I also think that we need to have a far better conversation. I agree with Chippy. I don't see Luke Malpass having a good conversation about this, or Tracy Watkins, or Andrea Vance, or I don't see Thomas Coughlin talking about our assets and our net worth at the New Zealand Herald. I don't see Joe Moyer having that conversation. There's nobody in the press gallery that wants to talk about the more accurate picture about New Zealand's relative position when it comes to net core crown debt, and the fact that New Zealand is well below the current OECD average for net core crown debt compared to countries that we do compare ourselves with. And I think that the reason the press leave this out is so that Nicola Willis can triumph, that everybody in the public will just say, when you ask me about it, I don't want to go into any more debt, because these voices in the media have already coached me and basically brainwashed me with one side of the argument only for a long period of time. And now I think, well, we're just going to have to accept austerity for New Zealand, and Nicola Willis must be right. She was right about the ferries after all. I mean, Winston Peters just allocated $4 billion to replace them, and no one talks about that. So anyway, that's enough from me. I'm just probably talking too much now. But I hope you found this edition of G News really interesting, especially the visual little video I put together to try and explain what's a little bit difficult in words to get across, but a picture shows much more clearly. Have a wonderful day, and thank you everyone for your continued support. G News, that's me for today. Talk again soon. I've got to go and record Parliament now. See you guys later.